The attorney's office smelled like old wood and lemon polish, the kind of scent that immediately transported me back to Grandma Rosa's living room. I had flown in overnight from Naval Station San Diego, catching a red-eye that landed me in this small coastal town just 3 hours before the reading. My eyes burned from lack of sleep, but I had learned long ago how to function through exhaustion. The Navy teaches you that much, at least. I wore civilian clothes, a simple navy blue dress I had packed hastily between briefings. No uniform today. This was family business, not Navy business, though the line between who I was and what I wore had blurred years ago. The conference room was paneled in dark oak, with maritime paintings lining the walls. Ships cutting through stormy seas, lighthouses standing sentinel against crashing waves. I wondered if Mr. Caldwell, the attorney, had chosen them deliberately, knowing Grandma's history, knowing ours. My eyes caught a framed photograph on the shelf behind his desk. Grandpa Miguel in his navy dress whites, young and proud, taken sometime before Korea. Before the letters that Grandma kept in her cedar chest, before everything. I was the last to arrive. Of course I was. Victoria sat at the head of the conference table as if she already owned the room. My sister wore a designer black dress that probably cost more than my monthly housing allowance, her blonde highlights perfectly styled, her makeup immaculate even in mourning. She had positioned herself directly across from Mr. Caldwell's chair, the seat of power, the seat of expectation. Marcus, her husband, sat beside her in a charcoal suit, scrolling through his phone with the bored expression of a man who considered this a minor inconvenience in his busy schedule of managing other people's money. Aunt Patricia flanked Vicky's other side, dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief she probably brought as a prop. Cousin Derek slouched in the corner, already checking his watch. The family, my family, such as it was. Vicky looked up when I entered, and her lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. Well, surprised you got leave from your little boat job. Try not to track saltwater on the carpet." I said nothing. I simply took the empty seat at the far end of the table, the seat that had been left for me like an afterthought. Marcus chuckled without looking up from his phone. The military's basically charity work with a uniform. Hopefully, Rosa left you enough to finally get a real job. Aunt Patricia reached over to pat Vicky's hand, her whisper carrying clearly across the room. "Rosa always loved your stability, dear. She knew you'd take care of everything." I watched my sister nod with practiced humility, already mentally redecorating, already calculating the value of 4 generations of family history. She had been doing this my entire life, performing grief the way she performed everything else. Loudly, publicly, for an audience. Mr. Caldwell entered then, a thin man in his 60s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He carried a leather folder and something else, a wooden box that he set carefully on the table beside his chair. I noticed him glance at me, just briefly, with an expression I could not quite read. "Thank you all for coming," he began, settling into his seat. "Rosa was very specific about her wishes, and I want to ensure we honor them precisely." Vicky leaned forward, eager. "Of course, we're all family here." Family, I almost laughed. We had not been family in years, not really. Not since I made the choice that separated me from everything they understood, everything they valued. Mr. Caldwell opened his folder. The room fell silent, the kind of heavy silence that precedes either celebration or disaster. I could feel Vicky's anticipation radiating across the table, could see Marcus sit up straighter, could hear Aunt Patricia's breathing quicken. They were waiting for what they believed was rightfully theirs. The Victorian house on the cliff that had been in our family for 4 generations. The land. The legacy. They had already divided it in their minds, had probably discussed it over dinners I was never invited to, had made plans that did not include me. I expected nothing. I had come for closure, for a final goodbye to the woman who had been my anchor when everyone else had cut me loose. If Grandma left me a photograph, one of Grandpa's old letters, even just a mention in her words, that would be enough. Vicky caught my eye across the table and smirked, that familiar expression of superiority she had perfected over 38 years of practice. I held her gaze and thought, as I had thought 1,000 times before, on ships and in storms, and through every moment when I wanted to scream but chose instead to endure. The sea taught me patience, and patience always outlasts pride. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat and began to read. I, Rosa Maria Vasquez, being of sound mind and body, do hereby bequeath my estate, including all property, assets, and holdings, to my granddaughter. He paused, the silence stretched. Elena Maria Vasquez. The words hung in the air like smoke after cannon fire. I heard them, processed them, but they did not immediately register as real. My name. Grandma had said my name. Vicky's face cycled through emotions like a slot machine that could not land on a winner. Confusion first, her perfectly shaped eyebrows drawing together. Then disbelief, her mouth opening slightly. Then something darker, something that twisted her features in a way I had never seen before. But before anyone could speak, before Vicky could launch the protest that was clearly building behind her eyes, my mind slipped backward. The way it always did in moments of crisis. The Navy had trained me to assess, to analyze, to understand how I had arrived at any given moment. And sitting in that conference room, hearing my grandmother's final gift, I found myself back at the beginning. I was 18 years old, standing in our family kitchen, the acceptance letter from the Navy recruitment office clutched in my hands. My father sat at the table, his newspaper lowered, his face unreadable. My mother stood at the sink, her back to me, her shoulders tense. And Vicky, 22 and already climbing the corporate ladder at her first real job, leaned against the counter with her arms crossed and a smile playing at her lips. The Navy, my father said, not a question, a statement of disbelief. I ship out for boot camp in 6 weeks, I told him. My voice did not waver. I had practiced this moment in my bedroom mirror for 3 days. I've already signed the papers. You'll be back in 6 months. That was Vicky, her voice dripping with amusement. You can barely handle camping, Alina. You think you're going to survive on a boat. Ship, I corrected automatically. They're called ships. She rolled her eyes. Whatever, this is just another one of your phases. Remember when you wanted to be a veterinarian, a photographer, you never stick with anything. My father folded his newspaper carefully, the way he did when he was choosing his words. Your grandfather served, he said finally. It nearly broke your grandmother when he left. The letters, the waiting, the not knowing. Is that what you want, to put us through that? I wanted to tell him that Grandma had been the one to suggest it, that she had shown me Grandpa's medals, his photographs, his letters home, and told me that some people were meant to stay planted and others were meant to sail. I wanted to tell him that she had seen something in me that no one else had bothered to look for. Instead, I said, I want to serve. I want to do something that matters. Vicky laughed. And what we do doesn't matter. I'm building a career, Alina, a real career, with a salary and benefits and a future. What are you going to have? A uniform and a cot. My mother finally turned from the sink. Her eyes were wet. You could die, she whispered. You could go somewhere far away and never come back. I could also live, I said. I could see things, do things, be part of something bigger than this kitchen. The silence that followed was the first of many. The first of countless dinners where my choices were questioned, my path was mocked, my life was reduced to a punchline in someone else's joke. 6 weeks later, I boarded a bus to boot camp. Only Grandma Rosa came to see me off. She pressed a small journal into my hands and told me to write to her from wherever the sea took me. They don't understand, she said, her eyes fierce and proud. But I do. Your grandfather would be so proud of you, Mija, so proud. I wrote my first letter to her from the aircraft carrier USS Theodore Roosevelt, 3 months into my initial deployment. I described the sunrise over the Pacific, the way the light turned the water into liquid gold, the feeling of standing on the flight deck, and knowing that I was part of something vast and important. I told her about the sailors I was learning to lead, about the officers who saw potential in me that my family never had. I told her I was scared and excited and alive in a way I had never been before. She wrote back within a week. Her letters smelled like lavender and coffee, and she always signed them the same way. Your proud abuela, Rosa. The years accumulated like barnacles on a hull. Each holiday I managed to come home became an exercise in endurance. I would arrive in uniform, proud of the rank I had earned, and within hours I would feel smaller than the ensign I had once been. My first Christmas home after boot camp, Vicky announced her promotion to regional manager. The family gathered around her, congratulations flowing like wine. My mother asked about her new office, her new salary, her new car. My father nodded with approval, finally seeing in his eldest daughter the success he had always envisioned. When the attention finally, briefly, turned to me, Uncle Richard asked, "So what do you actually do on those ships? You just clean things." I explained that I was training for officer candidate school, that I was learning navigation and leadership and crisis management. I explained that I had been selected for advanced training, that my commanding officers had identified me as someone with potential. Vicky interrupted. "That's nice, but when are you going to settle down? Get a real job, start a family." She gestured to Marcus, her new boyfriend at the time, who sat beside her with the smug satisfaction of a man who had never questioned his place in the world. "We're thinking about getting engaged next year. Maybe by then you'll have figured out what you actually want to do with your life." Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and the family had dispersed to their usual corners, Grandma Rosa found me on the back porch. The December air was sharp, but I did not feel the cold. I felt numb in a different way. "Come with me," she said, and led me to her bedroom. From her closet, she pulled a cedar chest I had seen 100 times but never opened. Inside were Grandpa Miguel's service medals, his photographs in uniform, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon. She spread them across her bed like treasures, which is exactly what they were. "Your grandfather wrote me from Korea," she said, her fingers brushing the old paper with reverence. "Every week, sometimes more. He told me about the fear, the boredom, the moments of beauty that surprised him. He told me about the men he served with, the ones he saved, the ones he lost." She looked at me, her dark eyes bright. "He was not understood either, Alina. His family thought he was foolish to volunteer. His brothers stayed home and worked in factories and raised their children where they could see them. But Miguel knew that some callings cannot be ignored." She pressed one of his medals into my palm, a bronze star. I had not known he had earned it. "They don't see you," Grandma said. "But I do. Keep writing to me, Mija. Tell me everything. When you feel invisible here, remember that there is one person who sees you clearly." I kept my promise. Over the next 12 years, I wrote her 127 letters. From aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf, from naval bases in Japan and Bahrain and Italy, from hospital ships where I helped coordinate humanitarian relief after earthquakes and tsunamis. I wrote to her about my promotions, each one a small victory I shared with no one else. I wrote about the rescue mission that earned me my commendation, the 47 sailors whose lives I helped save when their vessel was sinking in rough seas. I wrote about the terror and the triumph and the moments when I wondered if I had made the right choice. And every time I came home, the pattern repeated. Thanksgiving, 5 years ago, Vicky announced her promotion to senior vice president, and the table erupted in applause. When the noise died down, I mentioned quietly that I had been selected for commander. "Commander of what?" Marcus asked with a laugh. "Swabbing decks." The table chuckled. My mother changed the subject to Vicky's new house. My father asked Marcus about his investment portfolio. Under the table, Grandma Rosa's hand found mine and squeezed. That silent gesture said everything her voice could not. "I know, I see you, I am proud." It was always enough. She was always enough. And now she was gone, and I was sitting in an attorney's office, and my name had just been read aloud as the sole inheritor of everything she had built and preserved and loved. The memory faded. The conference room came back into focus. Vicky's face had settled into something cold and calculating, the expression she wore when preparing for battle. Marcus had finally put down his phone. Aunt Patricia's hand had frozen mid-reach toward Vicky's shoulder. And I sat at the far end of the table, my heart pounding with something that was not quite grief and not quite joy, waiting for the storm I knew was coming. The silence lasted exactly 4 seconds. I know because I counted, the the way I had learned to count during crisis drills on the ship. 4 seconds to assess, 4 seconds to prepare, 4 seconds before the chaos begins. Then Vicky exploded. "That's impossible." Her chair scraped back as she half rose from her seat, her palms pressed flat against the conference table. "There has to be a mistake. Read it again." Mr. Caldwell regarded her calmly over the rim of his glasses. He had clearly anticipated this reaction. "I assure you, Mrs. Moore, there is no mistake. I drafted this will myself, at Rose's explicit direction, and witnessed her signature along with 2 other parties." "But that doesn't make any sense." Vicky's voice had taken on a sharp edge, the tone she used when subordinates failed to meet her expectations. "Alina hasn't been here. She's never here. She missed Grandma's 80th birthday. She missed Christmas 3 years in a row. She wasn't even at the funeral because she was on some boat somewhere." "Ship," I said quietly. It was automatic, a reflex. It was a ship, and I was coordinating disaster relief in the Philippines. I requested emergency leave, but we were in the middle of operations. Grandma understood. Grandma understood. Vicky repeated my words mockingly. "Of course she did, because you could do no wrong in her eyes, could you, even when you abandoned her?" The accusation stung, though I tried not to show it. I had missed so much. Every deployment meant another birthday, another holiday, another family gathering where my absence was noted and cataloged and used as evidence of my failures. But Grandma had never held it against me. Her letters told me so, over and over. "You are where you need to be," she wrote once. "The sea has claimed you, Mija, and I would never ask it to give you back." Marcus leaned forward, his financial analyst brain already calculating angles. "Let's not get emotional here. There must be provisions for the rest of the family. No one leaves everything to one grandchild. It's not done." Mr. Caldwell turned a page in his folder. Rose's wishes were quite specific. The estate, including the house, the land, and all financial holdings, goes to Alina. She did, however, leave personal items to other family members. Victoria receives Rose's jewelry collection. Patricia receives the china set that belonged to Rose's mother. And there are smaller bequests to other relatives. "Jewelry," Vicky said the word like it was poison. "She left me jewelry while Alina gets a $4 million estate." I felt the number hit me like a rogue wave. $4 million. I had not known. I had never asked about Grandma's finances, never cared about what she might leave behind. She was my grandmother, not a line item in a ledger. Aunt Patricia finally found her voice. "Surely there's been some undue influence here. Alina was always trying to get into Rose's good graces. All those letters, those phone calls. She was manipulating her." "Manipulating her?" The words came out before I could stop them, hot and sharp. "I wrote to her because I loved her, because she was the only person in this family who ever made me feel like I mattered." "Oh, please," Vicky rolled her eyes. The martyr routine again. Poor Alina, so misunderstood, so unappreciated. You chose to leave, remember? You chose your precious Navy over your family. And now you want to act like you're the victim. I could feel my composure slipping, the careful walls I had built over 16 years of service threatening to crack. On my ship, I commanded respect. My crew followed my orders without question because they trusted me, because I had earned my rank through sacrifice and skill and unwavering dedication. But here, in this room, I was still the little sister who could never measure up, the disappointment who had chosen wrong. Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat. "If I may continue." Vicky rounded on him. "Continue? What more is there? You've just told us that my grandmother lost her mind and left everything to the one grandchild who was never around." "Your grandmother was of sound mind," Mr. Caldwell said, his voice firmer now. "I have documentation to that effect, including a cognitive evaluation performed 6 months before her death. Additionally, Rosa left specific instructions that a personal letter be read aloud to the family. She was adamant that everyone hear her words." He reached for the wooden box I had noticed earlier. It was old, the wood dark with age and polished smooth by countless hands. I recognized it suddenly. It was the same cedar box from Grandma's bedroom, the one that held Grandpa's medals and letters. "This letter is to be read in its entirety, without interruption," Mr. Caldwell said. Those were Rose's explicit instructions. "I'm not sitting here to listen to more of this nonsense." Marcus stood, reaching for his jacket. "Vicky, let's go. We'll contest the will. No judge is going to uphold this." "Sit down, Marcus." My voice surprised me with its authority. The command voice, my XO called it. The tone I used when lives were on the line and there was no room for debate. "Grandma asked for her letter to be read. The least you can do is listen." Marcus froze, something in my tone cutting through his bluster. He looked at Vicky, uncertain. She stared at me across the table, her eyes narrowed, reassessing me as if seeing someone she did not quite recognize. "Fine," she said finally, lowering herself back into her chair. "Read the letter. Let's hear what excuse she came up with for cutting her own granddaughter out of her legacy." Mr. Caldwell nodded and opened the wooden box. Inside, I could see stacks of paper, bundled and tied with blue ribbon. My breath caught. Those were my letters. Every letter I had ever sent her, preserved and organized and kept close. She had saved them all. But it was not my letters that Mr. Caldwell reached for. It was a single envelope, cream-colored and thick, with Grandma's familiar handwriting on the front. He opened it carefully, reverently, and unfolded the pages inside. I had not expected this. I had come here expecting nothing, wanting only to honor Grandma's memory, and then return to my ship, to the world that made sense, to the water that had become more home to me than any building could ever be. I had not expected to be sitting in a room with people who despised me, waiting to hear my grandmother's final words. I thought about leaving, about standing up and walking out and letting them fight over whatever they wanted to fight over. The estate meant nothing to me. The money meant nothing. What mattered was that Grandma had remembered me, had thought of me at the end. But something held me in place. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the Navy discipline that had taught me to see things through to completion. Or maybe it was the quiet certainty that Grandma had wanted me here in this moment, for a reason I did not yet understand. I straightened in my chair, squaring my shoulders the way I did on the bridge of my ship when we were heading into uncertain waters. Whatever came next, I would face it. I owed Grandma that much. Mr. Caldwell began to read. "To my family, who never understood what service means." The opening line fell into the room like an anchor dropping into still water. I watched Vicky's jaw tighten, watched Marcus shift uncomfortably in his chair, watched Aunt Patricia's hand flutter to her throat, as if she could physically ward off whatever was coming. Mr. Caldwell continued, his voice measured and clear, giving weight to every word Grandma had written. "I am writing this letter at 86 years old, with a clear mind and a full heart. I have lived long enough to see the truth of my family, and I find that as I approach the end of my journey, I can no longer remain silent about what I have witnessed." He paused to turn the page. The only sound in the room was the soft rustle of paper and the distant ticking of a clock somewhere in the building. "My father, Antonio Reyes, served in the United States Navy during the Second World War. He was 19 years old when he shipped out, a boy from a small coastal town who had never been more than 50 miles from home. His family thought he was foolish. His brothers called him a dreamer. His mother wept and begged him to stay. But Antonio knew that some things are worth more than safety, more than comfort, more than the approval of those who cannot see beyond their own small lives." I felt tears prick at my eyes. I had heard pieces of this story before, fragments Grandma had shared over the years, but never like this, never laid out with such purpose. Antonio served on the USS Indianapolis. He survived the sinking that killed nearly 900 of his shipmates. He floated in the Pacific Ocean for 4 days, surrounded by sharks and death, holding on to the men beside him and praying for rescue. When he finally came home, he was not the same boy who had left. He carried scars that no one could see, wounds that never fully healed, but he also carried pride. He had served something greater than himself, and that service defined him until the day he died. Mr. Caldwell glanced up briefly, perhaps to gauge our reactions. Vicky's face had gone carefully blank, the expression she wore when she was calculating her next move. I kept my eyes fixed on the attorney, drinking in every word like water in a desert. My husband, Miguel Vasquez, was cut from the same cloth. He served in Korea, another war that history has tried to forget. He wrote me letters that I have kept for 60 years, letters that told me of his fear and his courage and his unwavering belief that what he was doing mattered. I waited for him, and he came home to me, and together we built a life in the house that his grandfather had built with his own hands. The house, the Victorian on the cliff, with its widow's walk and its view of the endless sea. I had spent summers there as a child, before the divide between my sister and me had become uncrossable. I remembered running through the rooms, listening to Grandma's stories, feeling the weight of history in every creaking floorboard. I have watched my granddaughters grow into women, and I have seen who they have become. Victoria, my eldest, chose the path of safety. She built a career that could be measured in titles and salaries, in corner offices and company cars. She visited me on holidays, always with cameras ready to capture the moment for her social media accounts, always rushing to leave before the dishes were cleared. In 15 years, Victoria never once wrote me a letter. Not one. Vicky's face flushed red. She opened her mouth to speak, but Mr. Caldwell held up a hand. Rosa was adamant that this letter be read without interruption. Please. My sister clamped her mouth shut, her nostrils flaring with barely contained fury. Alina, my youngest, chose a different path. At 18 years old, she stood in her parents' kitchen and announced that she had enlisted in the Navy. Her father was disappointed. Her mother was frightened. Her sister laughed and predicted failure. But Alina did not waver. She shipped out to boot camp with nothing but a small bag and a journal I had given her, and she began to write. Mr. Caldwell reached into the wooden box and lifted out one of the bundles of letters. The blue ribbon caught the afternoon light, faded but still intact. 127 letters. That is how many Alina sent me over 12 years of service. She wrote from aircraft carriers and naval bases, from hospital ships and foreign ports. She told me about sunrises over oceans I will never see, about storms that tested her courage, about the sailors she led and the lives she saved. She told me about her fears and her triumphs, her doubts and her certainties. She gave me pieces of her soul from across every ocean on this earth. My hands were trembling. I pressed them flat against my thighs beneath the table, willing them to be still. I kept every letter. I read them over and over, sometimes late at night when I could not sleep, sometimes early in the morning with my coffee. They were my window into a world I could never visit, a life I could only imagine. And through those letters, I watched my granddaughter transform from an uncertain girl into a woman of extraordinary strength and character. Mr. Caldwell turned another page, and when he continued, his voice had grown softer, more intimate. Alina once wrote to me, "The sea taught me patience, Grandma, and patience always outlasts pride." I kept that letter by my bedside for 7 years. I read it whenever I felt alone, whenever I wondered if the choices I had made were the right ones, whenever I missed Miguel so desperately that I thought my heart would shatter. Alina's words gave me strength. Her faith gave me hope. I remembered writing those words. It was after a particularly difficult deployment, when I had questioned everything about my life and my choices. Grandma had written back immediately, telling me that doubt was the companion of the brave, that only fools were certain of everything. She had reminded me of Grandpa Miguel, of how he had struggled after Korea, of how he had found his way back to himself through the love of his family. I have watched my family treat Alina with casual cruelty for 16 years. I have watched her be dismissed and mocked, her achievements ignored, her sacrifices belittled. I have watched Victoria call her a disappointment, watched Marcus joke about her salary, watched the people who should have loved her most make her feel small and worthless. The silence in the room had become suffocating. Aunt Patricia was staring at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Cousin Derek had slumped so low in his chair he was nearly horizontal. Marcus had gone pale. And through it all, Alina never fought back. She never defended herself, never demanded recognition, never asked for anything but kindness. She endured with grace and dignity because that is who she is. That is the woman the Navy shaped her into. That is the woman I have been proud to call my granddaughter. Mr. Caldwell paused, took a sip of water from a glass at his elbow, and continued. What my family does not know, what Alina herself may not realize, is that I followed her career from afar. I kept newspaper clippings of her commendations. I tracked her deployments through the Navy's public records. And 3 years ago, when she was promoted to commander, I flew to San Diego to watch the ceremony. My breath stopped. She had been there. Grandma had been there, and I had not known. I sat in the back row, an old woman in a borrowed dress, and I watched my granddaughter receive her new rank. I watched her stand at attention, her shoulders straight, her eyes forward, embodying everything her great-grandfather and grandfather had believed in. I wept with pride. And then I left because I did not want to intrude on her moment, did not want to make it about me when it should have been about her. The tears I had been fighting broke free. They rolled down my cheeks, and I did not wipe them away. I let them fall, let them mark this moment, let them honor the woman who had loved me so completely and so quietly. Victoria visited me 4 times in the last 5 years. Alina, from her ship on the other side of the world, arranged and paid for my full-time nursing care. She called every week when she could, wrote letters when she could not, sent flowers on every birthday and holiday. She never missed an anniversary of Miguel's death. Not once. Vicky's face had gone from red to white. She was gripping the arms of her chair so tightly her knuckles had blanched. I have one thing left to say, and I want Victoria to hear it clearly. Mr. Caldwell looked up, meeting Vicky's eyes across the table. You called your sister a disappointment. You laughed at her service. You never once asked about her life, her struggles, her dreams. You measured her worth by standards she never claimed and found her wanting by a scale she never asked to stand on. He returned to the letter, his voice steady and unflinching. Victoria, you chose to perform love. Alina chose to live it. There is a difference, and at 87 years old, I know which one matters. The words echoed in the silence like the final toll of a ship's bell. I could feel their weight pressing down on everyone in the room, a verdict delivered from beyond the grave by the one person whose opinion none of us could dismiss. Mr. Caldwell turned to the final page of Grandma's letter, and when he spoke again, his voice had gentled. And now I turned to Alina, my brave girl, my sailor's heart. I gripped the edge of my chair, steadying myself against the wave of emotion that threatened to capsize me. Alina, I know you never asked for recognition. I know you never wanted wealth or property or any of the things this world uses to measure success. You wanted only to serve, to matter, to carry forward the legacy that your great-grandfather and grandfather began. And you have done that, Mija. You have done it with honor and courage and a grace that takes my breath away. My chest ached with a pain that was also somehow joy. It was the feeling of being seen, truly seen, by someone who had looked past all the noise and found the truth beneath. My Alina commands a destroyer squadron. She has led humanitarian relief operations that saved countless lives. She earned a commendation for valor when she helped rescue 47 sailors from a sinking vessel in rough seas. She has served her country with the same dedication and sacrifice that my father and my husband gave, and she has done it while her own family called her a disappointment. I heard Aunt Patricia gasp softly. Even Cousin Derek had straightened in his chair, his earlier indifference replaced by something that might have been shame. You were never a disappointment, Alina. You were my greatest pride. Every letter you sent me was proof that my father's legacy lived on, that the Reyes and Vasquez blood ran true in at least one of my grandchildren. When I watched you receive your commander's rank, I knew that everything I had hoped for you had come to pass. You had become the woman I always believed you could be. Mr. Caldwell set down the letter for a moment and reached into the wooden box. He lifted out a small velvet case, worn at the corners, and opened it carefully. Inside, catching the autumn light that filtered through the window, were 3 medals. I recognized them instantly. Grandpa Miguel's service medals from Korea, including the bronze star that Grandma had shown me all those years ago. Rosa's instructions are specific, Mr. Caldwell said, his voice thick with emotion he was struggling to contain. These medals are to be passed to Alina, to be kept and honored as part of the family's naval heritage. Rosa believed that Alina was the rightful heir to this legacy, the one who understood its weight and its meaning. He placed the velvet case on the table and slid it toward me. My hands were shaking as I reached for it, as my fingers touched the cool metal that had once hung on my grandfather's chest. I could almost feel his presence in that moment, standing beside Grandma, both of them watching over me with the fierce pride I had always longed for from the living. Mr. Caldwell returned to the letter. And now, my final words to all of you. The room seemed to hold its breath. The house on the cliff was built by a sailor's hands. My grandfather constructed it when he returned from the sea, building it plank by plank, nail by nail, facing it toward the water he had loved and feared and survived. It has belonged to sailors ever since. My father lived there after the war. My husband and I raised our children there, and now it will belong to Alina, the only one of my descendants who understands what it means to face the horizon and sail toward it. I thought of the house, perched on its rocky promontory, the widow's walk where Grandma used to stand and watch for ships, the rooms filled with photographs and memories, and the accumulated love of generations. It had always felt more like home to me than my parents' suburban split level, more like a place I belonged than any apartment I had rented between deployments. Alina, my darling girl, I leave you the house not as a burden but as a gift. Fill it with love, as I did. Fill it with letters and stories and the sounds of a family that chooses each other. And when you stand on the widow's walk at sunset, remember that I am there with you, watching the same horizon, proud beyond measure of the woman you have become. Mr. Caldwell's voice caught on the final words. He cleared his throat, composed himself, and read the closing. The sea taught you patience, Mija, and your patience has outlasted all of their pride. This is your victory, earned not through conflict but through endurance, through faith, through the quiet certainty that you were always exactly who you were meant to be. He set down the letter and reached once more into the wooden box. This time he lifted out the entire stack of letters, all 127 of them, tied together with the faded blue ribbon I had noticed earlier. He placed them on the table beside the medals. These letters are part of the estate, he said softly, speaking to me now rather than to the room. Rosa wanted you to have them back. She said that you might need to read them again someday, to remember who you were when you felt lost. I pulled the bundle toward me, feeling the weight of 12 years of my own words, my own fears, my own hopes. Each letter was a piece of me that I had sent across oceans, and Grandma had kept every single one. She had held on to me even when I was thousands of miles away, even when the rest of the family had let me go. There is one final item, Mr. Caldwell said. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a smaller envelope, this one addressed in Grandma's handwriting to my Alina. He handed it across the table to me. Rosa asked that you read this privately, when you're ready. She said you would know when the time was right. I took the envelope, feeling its slight weight, wondering what words Grandma had saved for me alone. I slipped it into my pocket, close to my heart, where it would wait until I could give it the attention it deserved. The reading was finished. Grandma's voice, channeled through Mr. Caldwell's careful recitation, faded into silence. The room seemed smaller now, the walls pressing in, the air heavy with truths that could not be unspoken. I looked down at the treasures spread before me. The medals that connected me to a grandfather I had never met but had always admired. The letters that proved Grandma had never forgotten me, had never stopped believing in me. The knowledge that I had been loved, truly loved, by at least one person in my family. And then I looked up, across the table, at the faces of the people who had spent 16 years making me feel small. Vicky sat frozen, her perfect composure finally cracked. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes fixed on some middle distance, as if she could not quite process what she had heard. The sister who had always been so quick with a cutting remark, so ready with a dismissive laugh, had been rendered speechless by the words of a dead woman. Marcus had lost all color in his face. His phone lay forgotten on the table, his investment portfolios and market analyses suddenly irrelevant. He looked like a man who had just realized that all his calculations had been wrong, that he had been counting the wrong things all along. Aunt Patricia was crying, though whether from grief or guilt or simple shock I could not tell. Her handkerchief was pressed to her mouth, muffling the small sounds that escaped her. She would not meet my eyes. And Cousin Derek, who had always been content to follow Vicky's lead, to laugh when she laughed and sneer when she sneered, sat staring at the floor with the expression of someone who had just been shown a mirror and did not like what he saw. I felt the weight of their gazes when they finally turned to me. I felt their reassessment, their recalculation, their sudden understanding that the person they had dismissed for so long was not who they had believed her to be. But I did not feel triumph. I did not feel vindication. I felt only a profound sadness, a grief that went deeper than just the loss of Grandma. I grieved for the family we might have been, for the relationships that had been poisoned by jealousy and misunderstanding, for the years I had spent longing for acceptance that never came. I looked at the framed photograph of Grandpa Miguel on Mr. Caldwell's shelf. He stared back at me across decades, young and proud in his navy whites, a man who had survived sharks and sinking ships and come home to build a life of meaning. I wondered what he would say if he could see us now, his descendants gathered in this room, finally confronting the truth of who they had become. And then I thought of Grandma, sitting at her desk in the house on the cliff, writing this letter that she knew would not be read until after she was gone. She had known exactly what she was doing. She had waited until she could no longer be argued with, no longer be persuaded or manipulated, and then she had spoken the truth with all the authority of the dead. She had given me her blessing, and she had given my family a reckoning. I gathered the medals and the letters, holding them against my chest like armor. Whatever came next, I would face it with the strength Grandma had always believed I possessed. I would honor her memory by being exactly who she had raised me to be. A sailor's granddaughter, a commander in the United States Navy, and finally, at long last, the keeper of the family legacy. The silence shattered like glass on concrete. Vicky surged to her feet, her chair scraping back so violently it nearly toppled. Her face had transformed from shock into something harder, something cornered and desperate and dangerous. The designer black dress that had seemed so elegant when she arrived now looked like armor hastily donned for a battle she had not expected to fight. "This is insane." Her voice came out too loud, too sharp, filling the room with jagged edges. She manipulated Grandma. That's what this is. She wasn't even here, and somehow she convinced an old woman to cut out her own family. I did not respond. I sat with the medals warm in my palm and the letters pressed against my heart, and I waited. The Navy had taught me many things, but perhaps the most valuable was this. In the face of incoming fire, sometimes the best strategy was to hold your position and let the enemy exhaust themselves. I was here. Vicky slapped her palm against the conference table, making the water glasses tremble and sending ripples across their surfaces. I was here, Elena. I showed up. I visited her. I took care of her. Where were you? Off on your boat somewhere playing sailor while the rest of us dealt with the real responsibility of being family. "Ship," I said quietly. "They're called ships." "I don't care what they're called." Vicky's composure was crumbling faster now, revealing something raw and wounded beneath the polished surface. Her carefully applied makeup was beginning to smear at the corners of her eyes, and her hands were shaking. "You abandoned her. You abandoned all of us. And now you're going to sit there and accept everything like you deserve it." Mr. Caldwell cleared his throat gently, the sound cutting through the tension like a foghorn through mist. "Mrs. Moore, I should mention that Rose's estate records include comprehensive documentation of her care arrangements over the past 5 years. Perhaps this information would be helpful in clarifying certain matters." Vicky turned on him, eyes blazing with the fury of someone who senses their carefully constructed narrative beginning to collapse. "What does that have to do with anything?" The attorney opened a manila folder and consulted his notes, his expression remaining professionally neutral despite the charged atmosphere. "According to these records, you visited Rosa 4 times in the final 5 years of her life. The visits averaged approximately 2 hours each, and at least 2 of them coincided with major holidays when photographs were taken and subsequently posted to various social media platforms." I watched Vicky's face cycle through several expressions: denial, indignation, calculation, before settling finally on defensive anger. "I was busy. I have a career. I have responsibilities that don't allow me to drop everything on a whim. I couldn't simply abandon my life to sit by her bedside day after day. "I understand," Mr. Caldwell said, his voice carrying the measured patience of a man who had witnessed many such scenes in his career. "However, the records also show that Alina arranged and paid for Rosa's full-time nursing care for the past 3 years. She coordinated with the care facility from overseas, often making calls at 3 in the morning due to the time difference between naval deployments and this time zone. She sent monthly care packages tailored to Rosa's preferences and arranged for weekly flower deliveries. Always Rosa's favorites, the yellow roses Miguel used to bring her." He paused, turning a page in his folder. "And she visited whenever her deployment schedule allowed, flying in on her own time and at her own expense, sometimes for as little as 48 hours before having to return to her duties." The information landed like artillery shells, each revelation another crater in the story Vicky had been telling herself, and telling everyone else, for years. Marcus stood abruptly, his lawyer instincts kicking in despite his visible shock. He straightened his expensive tie with hands that weren't quite steady. "None of that matters from a legal standpoint. We'll contest the will. Rosa was clearly under undue influence. An elderly woman being manipulated by someone who wasn't even physically present. Any competent judge will see through this immediately." Mr. Caldwell reached into his folder again, producing another document. Rosa anticipated that possibility. She was a remarkably thorough woman. She underwent a comprehensive cognitive evaluation 6 months before her death, conducted by Dr. Patricia Mendez, a board-certified geriatric psychiatrist with 30 years of experience. The evaluation confirmed that Rosa was of sound mind, fully capable of making her own decisions, and specifically stated that she showed no signs of cognitive impairment or susceptibility to external influence. Marcus's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering beneath his skin. Evaluations can be challenged. Expert witnesses can be hired to offer alternative interpretations. "They can," Mr. Caldwell agreed calmly. "However, Rosa also recorded a video testimony 3 months before her death, in which she clearly and articulately explained her wishes and the reasoning behind them. She spoke for 45 minutes without notes. I have a copy of that video, which can be provided to any court that requests it. I suspect most judges would find it quite compelling." Aunt Patricia, who had been quietly weeping throughout this exchange, her handkerchief twisted into a damp knot in her hands, suddenly looked up. Her mascara had run in dark rivers down her cheeks. Rosa was always a bit confused at the end. We all noticed it. She would forget where she put her glasses, repeat stories she had already told. This will must have been written during one of her episodes, when she wasn't thinking clearly. "The will was drafted and signed 18 months ago," Mr. Caldwell said patiently. "Well before any of the mild memory issues Rosa experienced in her final months, which, I might add, are entirely normal for someone of her age. And the video testimony was recorded after the psychiatric evaluation, specifically to address any future concerns about her mental state. Rosa was quite explicit about her reasons. She wanted there to be no doubt." The room fell silent again. I could see the family's strategies collapsing one by one, each attempt to invalidate Grandma's wishes meeting the wall of her careful preparation. She had known them. She had known exactly what they would try, and she had anticipated every move, outmaneuvering them from beyond the grave with the same quiet determination she had shown throughout her life. I felt a surge of love for her so powerful it nearly took my breath away. Even in death, she was protecting me. Even from beyond the grave, she was standing between me and the people who would try to take what she had given. Cousin Derek had been edging toward the door throughout the confrontation, his earlier smugness completely evaporated. Now he muttered something about needing to make an urgent phone call and slipped out of the room without meeting anyone's eyes, clearly wanting no part of whatever was coming next. I did not blame him. He had always been a follower, and without a clear winner to follow, he was lost. Vicky watched him go, her lips pressing into a thin line of contempt at his retreat. Then she turned back to me, and I saw that her eyes were wet now, though whether from grief or fury or wounded pride, I could not tell. Perhaps it was all three, tangled together in a knot she would never be able to unravel. "You think you've won," she said, her voice dropping to something low and bitter, almost a hiss. You think this proves something about who's the better sister, who loved Grandma more. But I know the truth. I know who you really are. You're the same scared little girl who ran away from home because she couldn't handle being compared to me, because she knew she would always come up short. I stood slowly, carefully, still holding the medals and letters against my chest. I met my sister's gaze across the polished conference table, and I saw in her eyes the reflection of every holiday dinner, every cutting remark, every casual cruelty she had inflicted over 16 years. I saw the insecurity that drove her, the fear that had made her so desperate to diminish me. And I saw, perhaps for the first time clearly, how small that fear had made her. "Vicky," I said, and my voice was steady, the command voice that could carry across a deck in a storm, now softened to something almost gentle. "I never needed you to be proud of me. I only ever needed you to be kind." She flinched as if I had struck her. "I spent years at sea learning that storms pass. Your opinion of me was just weather. It was never going to sink me, no matter how hard you tried. I had an anchor. Her name was Rosa." "Don't you dare," Vicky started, her voice cracking, but I kept going. "Grandma saw me. She saw who I was becoming, even when I couldn't see it myself. She wrote back to every single one of my letters in her own way, by keeping them, treasuring them, believing in me when no one else did. That was always enough. She was always enough." The thematic phrase rose in my mind. The words I had written to Grandma years ago on a night when I had doubted everything. The words she had kept by her bedside for 7 years. "The sea taught me patience," I said, looking at my sister with something that was not quite forgiveness but was no longer anger. "And patience always outlasts pride. I can wait for you to understand what Grandma was trying to tell you, or I can live without your understanding. Either way, I'm at peace." Vicky's face crumpled for just a moment, a crack in the armor she had worn for so long. For a single instant, I saw the sister I remembered from childhood, before the competition and the comparisons had poisoned everything between us. The girl who had taught me to ride a bike on the street outside our parents' house, who had braided my hair before school pictures, who had once climbed into my bed during thunderstorms because she knew I was afraid of the lightning. The girl who had been my best friend before she decided I was her rival. Then the moment passed, and the armor was back in place. She lifted her chin, and her eyes hardened. "This isn't over," she said coldly, though her voice wavered at the edges. "I'll fight this in court. I'll make sure everyone knows what you really are." I gathered the wooden box containing the letters, tucked the velvet case with Grandpa's medals carefully into my purse, and collected the folder of documents Mr. Caldwell had prepared for me. My movements were deliberate, unhurried. I had spent 16 years being rushed out of rooms by my family's impatience, their eagerness to move on to topics they found more interesting than my life. I would not be rushed now. "You can try," I said softly, meeting her gaze. "But Grandma made sure her voice would be heard even after she was gone. I don't think any court will silence her, and I suspect when you've had time to think, really think, you won't want to try." I turned to Mr. Caldwell and extended my hand. "Thank you for taking such good care of her all these years, for making sure her wishes were honored exactly as she wanted." He shook my hand warmly, his grip firm and reassuring. "Your grandmother was a remarkable woman, Commander Vasquez. It was my privilege to know her. She spoke of you often, you know." His voice softened. "Every time a new letter arrived, she would bring it to our meetings and read passages aloud. Her face would light up in a way I never saw at any other time. She was so proud of you. I wanted you to know that." My throat tightened, but I managed to nod. "Thank you. That means more than I can say." I walked toward the door, my footsteps steady on the hardwood floor. At the threshold, something made me pause. Some instinct I had developed over years of command, some sense that unfinished business remained and would haunt me if I left it unaddressed. Vicky's voice cut through the silence behind me. "You can't just leave. We need to talk about this. This is our family. This is our history. You can't just walk away with everything like it belongs to you." I turned slowly to face her. She stood in the center of the room, her designer dress slightly rumpled now, her perfect hair escaping its carefully arranged style. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the afternoon's revelations. I realized with a start that I was taller than her. I had never noticed that before. In my mind, she had always loomed so large. I've been ready to talk for 16 years, Vicky. You were too busy laughing to listen. She opened her mouth, closed it again. For once, my eloquent sister seemed at a loss for words. The house will be there when you're ready to visit, I continued, my voice gentler now. As a guest, not an owner. That's Grandma's wish, and it's mine too. She made it clear in her letter that she wanted the family to have access to the property, to the memories contained in those walls. She just didn't want it controlled by someone who didn't understand what it meant. And you think you understand? Vicky's voice was bitter, but there was something else beneath it now. Something that sounded almost like fear. You think a few years on a boat makes you qualified to carry on some grand family legacy. I think 127 letters makes me qualified, I said quietly. I think being the only person who asked Grandma about her father's time in the Navy, who learned Grandpa Miguel's stories by heart, who understood why that house faces the sea, and why the Widow's Walk was Grandma's favorite place. I think that makes me qualified. I took a breath, steadying myself for what came next. This was the hard part. This was the part of me that had been wounded so many times by this family that it had formed scar tissue, layers of protection built up over years of disappointment. But Grandma's letter had reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. That walls could protect, but they could also imprison. That somewhere beneath the scars, the capacity for love still existed. But Vicky, if you ever want to come, you have to come without the performance. Just show up as my sister. Not as my competitor, not as my critic, not as the successful one proving a point. Just as Victoria, my older sister, the girl who used to make me laugh until my stomach hurt. I paused, feeling the weight of every word. I'll be waiting. I've always been waiting, even when I didn't know it. The door was never closed from my side. Something shifted in her expression. The hardness wavered, and for just a moment, I saw real tears gathering in her eyes that had nothing to do with anger or wounded pride. Grief, perhaps, or recognition, or the weight of 16 years of choices she could never take back. Then Marcus touched her arm, murmuring something about needing to go, and the moment passed. She blinked rapidly, straightened her spine, and lifted her chin. "We'll see," she said shortly. "Don't expect me anytime soon." "I'm patient," I replied simply. "The sea taught me that." I walked out of the attorney's office, down the narrow hallway with its maritime paintings, and into the late autumn afternoon. The coastal air hit my face like a blessing, carrying the salt-sharp scent of the sea. I stood on the sidewalk for a long moment, breathing deeply, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries echoing off the old buildings of this small town where Grandma had lived her entire life. I sat in my rental car, but did not start the engine. Instead, I opened the wooden box and looked at the letters inside, my own handwriting staring back at me from a dozen different phases of my life. The top letter was dated 12 years ago, from my first deployment aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt. I untied the blue ribbon carefully and unfolded the yellowed paper. "Dear Grandma," I read aloud to the empty car, my voice barely above a whisper. "Today we crossed the Pacific, and I watched the sun rise over an ocean that seemed to go on forever. I thought about you standing on the Widow's Walk, looking out at this same water, and I felt closer to you than I ever have before. The other sailors think I'm strange for writing letters instead of sending emails, but you were right. There's something different about putting pen to paper, something more real. I miss you already, but I know you're with me. You're always with me." I refolded the letter carefully and returned it to the box. She had kept this. She had read it and treasured it and held it close, just as she had kept all the others. She had been with me across every ocean, even when I thought I was alone. Then I pulled out the smaller envelope Mr. Caldwell had given me, the one addressed simply to Myelina. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in Grandma's familiar handwriting. "My darling Alina," it began. "If you are reading this, then the hard part is over. The truth has been told and you are free." I read the rest through a blur of tears. Words of love and pride and hope for the future she would not live to see. And at the end, 3 simple sentences that broke me completely. "You were my greatest adventure, Mija. Watching you become who you were meant to be was the privilege of my life. Now go live yours, and know that I am sailing beside you always." I sat and wept, for the grandmother I had lost, for the family that might never heal, for the girl I had been and the woman I had become. When the tears finally subsided, I started the engine and drove toward the house on the cliff. The road wound along the coast, familiar from 100 childhood summers. As I crested the final hill, there it was, the Victorian silhouette against the evening sky, the widow's walk where Grandma had stood so many times, the windows glowing faintly gold in the setting sun. The key fit perfectly. The door swung open to reveal the house exactly as I remembered it. The photographs on the walls, the maritime artifacts, the faint scent of lavender and coffee that would always mean Grandma. Finally, I climbed to the widow's walk. I stood at the railing and looked out at the horizon. "The sea had taken me everywhere," I whispered to the wind and the water. "But you always knew I would come home, and now, finally, I have.